The morning sun shone bright, making the wet streets shine like silver. Near the park, three men stood together, watching a woman walk her German Shepherd. She moved calmly, her steps steady, her eyes fixed on her dog. "She comes at the same time every day," said Kyle, the tallest man. He wore a messy beard and an old leather jacket. "Morning at 7, evening at 6. Same path, same pace. She doesn't even look around." "Too predictable," Marco added. He was a thin man with tattoos snaking up his neck. "Makes our job easy. No surprises." Brent, the leader, leaned against a lamppost. He chewed a toothpick, his sharp eyes cold and focused. "Don't underestimate her," he warned. "That dog isn't just for show. It's smart and well-trained." Kyle chuckled, shaking his head. "It's just a dog. One good hit, and it'll run off like any other." Brent didn't laugh. His voice was firm. "You're wrong. That dog listens to her. If we mess up, it'll be trouble." Kyle kicked a small rock, muttering under his breath. "Fine. What's the plan then?" Brent pulled a crumpled paper from his pocket and opened it. He had drawn a simple map on it. "We wait until evening," he explained. "She always takes the alley on Maple Street. It's quiet there, no cameras, no people. We'll trap her." Marco frowned slightly. "What about the dog?" Brent smirked. "We'll distract it. Throw some food with something strong in it. That'll knock it out. Once the dog's down, she can't do anything." The three men studied the map carefully. They had been watching the woman for days and thought they had everything figured out. To them, she was an easy target, and her dog was just a small problem. But while they felt confident, the woman wasn't as clueless as they thought. She walked her usual route with her dog, but her sharp eyes didn't miss much. One evening, as she passed a corner store, she slowed down. Her gaze flicked to a car parked nearby. She had seen that car before. It wasn't always there, but lately it seemed to follow her everywhere. The German Shepherd, walking ahead of her, noticed her hesitation. It stopped and looked back at her, waiting for a signal. She brushed her leash slightly, and the dog's ears twitched. It stayed calm, acting as if nothing was wrong. Later that night, in her small kitchen, the woman sat at her table. In front of her was her own map of the neighborhood. She had marked several spots, including the alley on Maple Street. Her eyes narrowed as she stared at it. "They're watching us," she muttered, glancing at her dog lying on the floor beside her chair. "But they don't know who they're dealing with." The dog tilted its head, as if it understood every word. She smiled and reached down, scratching behind its ears. "Good boy," she said softly. "Let's give them a little surprise." Meanwhile, back at the park, the three men were laughing. Brent folded the map and slid it back into his pocket. "This will be quick and easy," he said with a grin. They all nodded, sure that nothing could go wrong. "Yeah, she won't see it coming," Kyle said with a wide grin. But as the three men walked away, none of them noticed the woman standing in the shadows. Her face was calm, but her eyes were sharp and serious. Standing beside her, the German Shepherd stayed perfectly still, its ears up and alert. The woman watched the men quietly, her hand resting on the leash. "She won't see it coming," Brent had said. But the truth was, they were the ones walking straight into a trap. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, the woman set out for her usual walk. The sky was painted in shades of orange and red, and the streets grew quieter as people went inside. Streetlights flickered on, throwing long shadows on the road. Her footsteps were steady as she walked down Pine Street, her big German Shepherd, Zeke, at her side. She looked calm, like any other evening, but her senses were sharp. She could feel it. Shadows shifted where they shouldn't. Footsteps echoed softly behind her, too far back to be normal. Tonight wasn't like the other nights. When she reached the narrow alley on Maple Street, she paused for just a moment. Zeke stopped too, his ears twitching, waiting for her cue. She gave a small nod, and he moved forward again, his steps quiet and careful. The alley was dark, wedged between two old brick walls. The woman's boots clicked softly on the pavement. Her grip on Zeke's leash tightened, though her face stayed calm. From behind her, she could hear faint murmurs and footsteps getting closer. At the far end of the alley, three men stepped into the light. Brent, Kyle, and Marco stood there, blocking her way. She stopped walking and turned slowly to face them, her hand tightening around Zeke's leash. Behind her, more footsteps. Someone else was closing in from the other side. She was surrounded now, with no clear way out. Brent grinned, looking pleased with himself. Well, he said, his voice full of fake charm. Looks like you made a mistake, lady. Wrong alley. The woman didn't answer. Her sharp eyes stayed on them. Zeke stood tall beside her, his gaze fixed on the men. His body was tense, ready for anything. Kyle smirked and took a step closer. What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or is your big dog doing all the thinking? Marco shifted uncomfortably. His eyes darted between Zeke and the woman. Maybe we should go, he mumbled nervously. That dog, I don't like the way it's looking at us. Brent shot him a glare. It's just a dog, he said sharply. Stick to the plan. Kyle pulled a brown paper bag from his jacket and tossed it on the ground in front of them. The smell of meat filled the air. He smiled, waiting for the dog to take the bait. But Zeke didn't move. He didn't even glance at the bag. His body stayed still, his muscles tight. A low, rumbling growl started deep in his chest. The woman tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but firm. You made a mistake. Brent laughed, though it sounded shaky. Oh yeah? And what are you going to do about it? She didn't answer. Instead, she reached down and unclipped Zeke's leash. The dog stepped forward, his growl getting louder, his sharp eyes locked on the men. Hey, Kyle said, backing up a step, but it was too late. The woman spoke one word, loud and clear. Zeke! Attack! Zeke moved fast, faster than any of them expected. He lunged at Kyle, knocking him to the ground. Kyle gasped as the dog grabbed his sleeve and dragged him away from the woman. Marco stumbled back, grabbing a rusty pipe from the ground. He swung it wildly, but Zeke dodged with ease. The dog leapt at him, forcing Marco against the wall. Zeke's teeth bared, his growl rumbling so close to Marco's face that the man froze, too scared to move. Brent stood frozen, his confidence completely gone. His hands shook as he raised them in the air. Call the dog off, he shouted. We didn't mean it. We didn't mean anything by it. The woman stepped forward, her expression cold. Didn't mean anything? You followed me. You cornered me. And now you want to walk away? Brent stammered, his voice breaking. Please, we'll leave you alone. Just call him off. She raised her hand, and Zeke backed away. He returned to her side, still growling, his sharp eyes never leaving the men. You don't get to just walk away from this, the woman said, pulling a small device from her pocket. She pressed a button, and a faint sound of sirens echoed in the distance. What did you do? Kyle croaked from the ground, clutching his arm. The woman smiled, just a small, sharp smile. I called the police. The color drained from their faces. Marco slid to the ground, trembling, while Brent stood frozen, too scared to move. You thought I was weak, she said softly, her voice cold. But you forgot something important. Weak doesn't mean powerless. Zeke let out one last growl, standing tall and proud at her side. As the sirens grew louder, the men realized they hadn't just picked the wrong alley. They had picked the wrong woman and the wrong dog. The woman laughed, but it wasn't a nice laugh. It was sharp and cold. Just a German Shepherd? Zeke isn't just a pet. He's a canine officer trained to take down people like you. The words hit the men hard. Marco's face turned pale. Kyle took a step back, his mouth open in shock. Brent, who always tried to act tough, suddenly looked scared. The woman stepped closer, her movements calm but strong. Zeke has seen more action than you'll ever know. He's caught criminals, rescued people, and even found bombs. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a shiny badge. It gleamed under the streetlight. And me? I'm Officer Elena Carter. You just made the worst mistake of your lives. The men stared at her, their confidence crushed. They had thought she was just another easy target. Now they realized they had messed with the wrong person, a trained cop with an expert dog. Kyle's hands shot up, shaking. We didn't know. We're sorry. Please, just let us go. Elena shook her head. Her voice was firm. No one is walking away from this. The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. Brent, looking desperate, clenched his fists. "We're not going down like this," he shouted and charged at her. "Zeke, apprehend," Elena commanded sharply. Zeke moved like lightning. He leapt at Brent, knocking him to the ground. Brent's back hit the pavement with a heavy thud, and Zeke pinned him there. The dog's growl was deep and threatening, his sharp teeth inches from Brent's arm. Brent froze, too scared to even breathe. Marco and Kyle stayed frozen in place, terrified. They didn't dare move as Zeke stood over their leader, showing just how dangerous he could be. Elena knelt beside Brent, her voice low and steady. "Don't even think about moving. If you try, Zeke won't hesitate. Do you understand?" Brent nodded quickly, his face pale and sweaty. "Yes, I understand." Elena stood and turned to the other two men. "You two against the wall, hands where I can see them." Marco and Kyle stumbled backward, pressing themselves against the wall. Their fear was written all over their faces. Zeke stayed alert, his sharp eyes watching them closely, ready to jump again if needed. A moment later, red and blue lights filled the alley. Police cars screeched to a stop, and officers stepped out, weapons ready. They moved quickly, handcuffing Brent, Kyle, and Marco. The men didn't resist. They looked small and scared as they were led away. One of the officers, Daniels, walked over to Elena. He gave her a nod. "Looks like you had it handled, Carter." Elena smiled faintly and patted Zeke on the head. "Zeke did most of the work. He always does." Daniels chuckled. "He's a good dog. Those guys didn't stand a chance." As the men were loaded into the police cars, Elena leaned against her squad car. Zeke sat beside her, his tail wagging slightly as he watched everything. "Good job, partner," Elena said quietly, rubbing Zeke behind the ears. The dog leaned into her touch, happy with her praise. Inside one of the police cars, the three men sat in silence. Brent glared at the floor, his fists clenched tight. Kyle and Marco exchanged nervous looks. Kyle whispered, "This wasn't supposed to happen. She was just a lady with a dog." Marco shook his head, his voice shaky. "She's a cop, and that dog isn't normal. It's like it knew everything we were going to do." Brent finally spoke, his voice low and bitter. "It wasn't just the dog. It was her. She tricked us." Kyle frowned, confused. "Tricked us? How? We've been watching her for days." Brent's jaw tightened. "Exactly. She knew we were watching. She set us up." Marco's eyes widened as he realized the truth. "We fell right into it." Outside, Elena stood with Daniels, watching the squad cars leave. Daniels crossed his arms. "You think this was a one-time thing?" Elena shook her head. "No, they were too organized. This wasn't random. I think they've done this before." Daniels nodded. "We'll run their records. If you're right, they might have a history." After Daniels walked away, Elena crouched beside Zeke. She scratched behind his ears, and he wagged his tail slightly. "What do you think, buddy?" she asked softly. "You think this is over?" Zeke gave a quiet bark, tilting his head. Elena smiled. "Yeah, me neither." In the back of the police car, Brent sat in angry silence. His mind was racing. This wasn't just a mistake. It was embarrassing. He clenched his fists, his anger growing with each passing second. "We can't let it end like this," he muttered. Marco looked at him nervously. "What are you talking about?" "It's over. We're caught." Brent's eyes narrowed. "It's not over. There's always a way to turn things around." Kyle, rubbing his bruised arm, gave a bitter laugh. "And how do you plan to do that?" "We're handcuffed in the back of a police car." Brent didn't answer right away. He leaned back, thinking hard. He wasn't just planning an escape. He wanted revenge. The woman and her dog had humiliated him, and he wasn't going to forget it. At the station, Daniels handed Elena a folder. "You were right," he said. "Brent, his real name is Brenton Reeves, is wanted for robberies in 3 states. He's not a small-time criminal." Elena nodded. "And the other 2? "Small records, but this guy's been teaching them. He's the leader, no doubt." Elena looked toward the holding cells, her jaw tight. "Then we make sure this is the last time he gets away with anything." Daniels nodded. "We'll build a strong case. With your testimony, they're not walking away from this." Later that night, as Elena drove home, Zeke sat quietly beside her. The streets were dark and calm, but her mind was racing. She glanced at Zeke. "They're not done," she said. "Brent's the kind who doesn't quit." Zeke wagged his tail slightly, his sharp eyes meeting hers. Elena smiled, reaching over to pat his fur. "Good thing we're ready for whatever happens next." Zeke gave a quiet bark, leaning into her touch. Together, they drove into the night, ready for whatever came their way.